This is our reading group for Merleau Ponty's um, The Structure of Behavior. Continuing with that text, we are picking up from page 166 of the translation. For those reading along, we are in chapter 3 of the book. So we looked at so this chapter is about these three orders of reality: the physical order, the vital order, and the human order, and what the relationship is between these three orders. um, and so we have gone through the physical and vital orders, and we're now on the human order. And yeah, so we looked at last time this. I think we just started on the human order last time, if I'm not mistaken. Sorry, I'm just scrolling back here. Um, right, yes, yeah. So we started on the human order last time, and then so yeah, the idea of this whole chapter is to try to understand this relationship between these three orders of reality, or three like forms of explanation of phenomena, um, not in terms of a sort of mutual exteriority of each of these orders to each other. And he takes this to be sort of the lesson, like pushing the lesson of Gestalt psychology sort of beyond where the Gestalt psychologists themselves pushed it. So um, in Gestalt psychology, there's this notion of a form as irreducible to components that would sort of secondarily be put into a form. So there's this sort of intrinsic structure in perception. Things like a circle or a triangle or whatever are not composed out of like structureless atoms. Um, and this notion of this sort of intrinsic structure, or this form that is not decomposable into formless atoms. Um, Merleau-Ponty wants to use this same notion to understand the relationship between these different orders of reality, so that there would be likewise. And so instead of saying like there's this sort of physical level of reality, um, um, and then this vital order, and then somehow we have to make a connection between them afterward, like after these two orders are constituted. um, Instead we have to see this relationship between the orders as intrinsic to those orders themselves, or like this sort of structure in which the physical and the vital are integrated is a sort of intrinsic structure, as opposed to something added on to already existing orders of reality. Um, so, like in terms of maybe a more like concrete understanding of what this would mean, it has to do with, for example, how we would evaluate um, knowledge of the vital order. So, like um, he talks about, for example, when we're doing biology, when we're trying to study an organism, we already have to sort of have a pre-theoretical understanding of what it is to be a living being, and something even fairly vague, and maybe something that will like correct and have a better understanding of later. But we have to have some sort of understanding of um, what kinds of things organisms do, like um, pursuing food, avoiding predators, adapting to changes in the environment that are potentially threatening, etc. All these sorts of things that organisms do. We have to sort of know what it means to um, pursue a goal, to avoid a threat, etc. Um, and this is already sort of presupposed when we do even like very mechanistic biological studies. If we're looking at like I don't know, protein synthesis in some sort of cell structure, etc. We still have some sort of understanding. Like we're interested in the processes going on in a cell, insofar as those processes are important to the overall life of that organism, and um, not not all the millions of other processes going on that are completely irrelevant to the life of that organism. So like um, I don't know, like uh, there's a certain amount of cosmic rays that are striking our bodies. Most of it gets filtered out through by the atmosphere, but like a certain amount makes it through. Um, and in general, that's like completely irrelevant to our lives as organisms. There's a certain chance that there will be mutations caused by this radiation and so on, but like in general, it has no sort of biological relevance. So like as a if you were a biologist and you say I want to study like you know cosmic radiation and how it interacts with like tree bark or whatever, it would be like a sort of irrelevant like a biologically irrelevant project. Whereas looking at tree bark is affected by, I don't know, atmospheric moisture or something like that, that might be relevant to the function of that tree bark in the life of the tree. Um, so yeah, just by selecting which things to study, we're already sort of presupposing an understanding of relevance to the life of the organism and what kinds of things organisms do. And so um, yeah, so this sort of understanding of a life of an organism is for Merleau-Ponty is already a kind of grasp of an intrinsic structure. We can't like start from this sort of conception of organisms as like a certain portion of matter, a certain like bundle of chemicals, undergoing certain processes, etc., and then try to like add on or to like to treat biological explanations as like a sort of shorthand for very complicated chemical processes. Um, we have to already have that understanding of living beings and what they do, and use that to figure out which of these chemical processes or physical processes are actually worth studying and are relevant to the life of that organism. And in particular, there's this notion that he's introduced or alluded to many times, this idea of like a melodic grasp or a melodic structure of a living being. So again, this was like one of the like first sort of examples that was used in Gestalt psychology for this idea of a intrinsic grasp of a structure. So the fact that you can recognize a melody even when it's transposed up or down, and there may not even be any single note that is shared between two different versions of the melody in different keys, but you can still recognize it as the same melody. Um, and so this melodic structure is also exhibited in the life of an organism. We can sort of grasp an organism's behavior as structured in terms of something like a life course, like the egg hatches and um, develops into a larva. The larva goes through a metamorphosis and becomes an adult, etc. This whole life cycle, even if statistically speaking, the vast majority of those eggs, I don't know if it's like butterflies or ants or whatever, the vast majority will never make it to the adult stage and reproduce and lay their own eggs. But we can still treat this life cycle as like the structure that is underlying the organism's empirically exhibited development. Um, so yeah, this sort of this life cycle is sort of analogous to a melody in terms of this intrinsic structure. And so, yeah, we want to use this same sort of approach to um, the human order. But so here, the difference is that we're talking about something that is, so in the case of the vital order, it's only for us as observers that this structure, this melodic structure, is sort of explicitly given. So the caterpillar developing into a butterfly doesn't sort of know about this melodic structure. It doesn't sort of contemplate the melody that is its life. It just exhibits it in its pattern of development. Um, Whereas we as observers can see the caterpillar becoming a butterfly and understand, can grasp the melodic structure of this life course. Um, so the sort of explicit grasp of the melodic structure is only for us as observers. It's external to the organism itself. But then in the case of the human order, um, it doesn't have this sort of external nature. So like something like um, I mean, when you talk about like sort of culture, you think of things like music and art and so on. Like it's sort of maybe high culture, but there's basic stuff like um, implements for eating, for example, a fork or chopsticks or whatever. Um, these tools or implements have a certain role in the life of a particular society, of the members of that society. Um, but part of what constitutes that role of a fork or a pair of chopsticks is precisely the way that the members of that society um, understand or like the explicit grasp that those people have of those objects. So like here, the understanding, the sort of internal viewpoint on these objects or these cultural products or whatever you want to call them, um, is partly constitutive of the structure itself. So it's not just as an observer outside of this society looking at what the people do with forks that this pattern or this melodic structure exists, but also in the way that the members of that society understand the what it is, what a fork is for example. Um, so here the grasp of that structure is actually part of that structure itself, as opposed to being like an external viewpoint on that structure. So that's sort of the um, important difference between the vital order and the human order that we are going to explore in more detail in the rest of this chapter. Okay, so I think that's good for a summary, and then we can pick up on page 166. Let's see. I think we are at lacking an adequate notion on that page. Someone would like to read from there.
They can read. Lacking an adequate notion of real consciousness, thinkers have been led to construct perception arbitrarily and without being able to take into account its descriptive characteristics. Let us try, on the contrary, to start from these characteristics and indicate how they compel us to conceive of the structure of consciousness. Nascent perception has the double character of being directed toward human intentions rather than toward objects of nature or the pure qualities, hot, cold, white, black, of which they are the supports, and of grasping them as experienced realities rather than as true objects. The representation of the objects of nature and of their qualities, the consciousness of truth, belong to a higher dialectic, and we will have to make them appear in the primitive life of consciousness, which we are trying for the moment to describe. It is a known fact that infantile perception attaches itself first of all to faces and gestures, in particular those of the mother. As long as one conserves the hypothesis of sensations, the face may appear insignificant. The tendencies and affections of the infant would make the face emerge from the mosaic of sensations, and the expression from the face, so that finally the sensations would become the barely conscious signs of an expression. But we have seen that the hypothesis of sensations is not justifiable. It follows from this that it is possible to perceive a smile, or even a sentiment in the smile, without the colors and the lines which quote unquote compose the face, as one says, being present to consciousness or given in an unconscious. Thus, the frequently noted fact that we can know a physiognomy perfectly without knowing the color of the eyes or of the hair, the form of the mouth or of the face should be taken quite literally. These alleged elements are present only in virtue of the contributions which they bring to the physiognomy, and it is from the latter that they are reconstituted in memory with great difficulty. It is the painters, certain painters, who have taught us, following Cézanne's expression, to regard faces as stones. The human signification is given before the alleged sensible signs. A face is a center of human expression, the transparent envelope of the attitudes and desires of others, the place of manifestation, the barely material support for a multitude of intentions. This is why it seems impossible for us to treat a face or a body, even a dead body, like a thing. They are sacred entities, not the, quote, givens of sight, unquote. One might be tempted to say that after the human body, it is the use objects created by man which compose the field of nascent perception. And indeed, their preponderance is striking in adults. In adults, ordinary reality is a human reality, and when use objects, a glove, a shoe, with their human mark are placed among natural objects and are contemplated as things for the first time, or when events on a crowd gathering, an accident, are seen through the panes of a window which shuts out their sound, and are brought to the condition of a pure spectacle and invested with a sort of eternity, we have the impression of acceding to another world, to a surreality, because the involvement which binds us to the human world is broken for the first time, because a nature, quote unquote, in itself, en soi, is allowed to show through. Here again, a mode of aesthetic perception, which appears absurd to so many adults, should not for this reason be made a part of primitive perception. Nevertheless, it should be noted that infants are unaware of the use of many objects, even when they have seen them handled. We ourselves can remember the marvelous appearance which things had when we did not know what they were for. The child must see many use objects without linking them to the human actions of which they are actually the support. But even then it is out of the question to suppose in children the perception of objects defined by an ensemble of quote unquote visual, quote unquote tactile, and quote unquote sonorous properties. This would be to forget the role which language plays in the constitution of the perceived world. So, Merleau-Ponty is, I think, he's acknowledges here that the perception of what he calls objects of nature and the pure qualities of objects of nature, natural objects, is of course possible in human experience, but it's an achievement, and isn't something that it doesn't characterize all of conscious life or human beings. And so he's starting with this sort of pre-objective consciousness, which he calls nascent perception or primitive perception, uh, in order to, I think, eventually show how the higher dialectic, as he puts it, of objectivity emerges from this really operative intentionality.
Yeah, so I think so we want to start with um oh, sorry, Angus, can you mute? I'm getting an echo. Yeah, thanks. Um, yeah, he wants to start with this uh, grasp of these use objects in terms of their use, and we can think of like Heidegger here, and the ready to hand, sort of the grasp of a hammer is precisely in hammering it and not just sort of staring at it and evaluating its properties. Um, and this is true of like any sort of human use object. So I mentioned a glove or a shoe. So like yeah, our sort of most basic or most like appropriate grasp of a glove is not just sort of staring at it and like contemplating its the color and texture of the surface and so on, but like just wearing the glove and using it as a glove. But then at the same time, we can stare at a glove and look at its colors. Like this is a possible way of perceiving an object. Um, and and he mentioned these sort of circumstances in which we do have this kind of more perception of objects. So like you can describing, you are maybe on a third or fourth floor window looking down on a crowd, and you don't hear anything, but you see people moving and doing things, and here the crowd makes them into a kind of aesthetic object that you can just sort of contemplate. You can sort of observe the movements of these people without like sort of being absorbed in the I guess human reality of the person. And then like these sort of use objects like the glove or the shoe. I think he might be thinking here of like Duchamp's use of like objects, just sort of taking an object, a use object, and exhibiting it as an art object. Just in itself, that like exhibition of the object makes us see it in a different way, and like sort of isolates it from the use of that object, the way it's sort of connected to all these practices and other objects that it belongs together with. So just like taking a hammer and putting it in an art gallery, for example, can like make it into an object of contemplation. But yeah, so that like this the fact that these use objects are most immediately grasped or most appropriately grasped by means of using them or like um, just sort of incorporating them into the practices that they're meant for doesn't mean that we can't also sort of remove them from those practices and have this aesthetic perception of them. And then the other sort of side of this, or the other version of this experience is with children who don't know how to use. I know that there was that on Twitter a couple years ago. There was the infamous incident with Bean Dad who didn't explain to his daughter how to use a can opener and tried to get her to figure it out for herself. But here, yeah, so this can opener, this sort of slightly complicated mechanical device. Um, the kid can't grasp it as a can opener um, just by using by using it to open a can as an adult who's familiar with this tool would be able to grasp it. But at the same time, it's not just like this child doesn't just sort of perceive an object with this color and this kind of surface texture and so on. It's still something recognizable as an instrument of some kind that presumably has some sort of purpose. Um, and it's precisely the fact that it, has clearly has a purpose of some kind that fits into some sort of practice that the dad is not explaining or not allowing the child to enter into, that makes it so frustrating. That, like, I know this is good for something, but you won't tell me what is good for. So yeah, so we never, like, even in this case when we see this, as a child, when you see this instrument that you don't know what it's for, or this object that is clearly um, made for some purpose or as part of some practice, and you don't know what it is, you still recognize it as something that is made for some practice or some purpose. You never just sort of experience it as this, like, pure object that is the bearer of certain sensory qualities. So yeah, so, like, even in these cases where we sort of uh, extract the object from the context of use that it's made for, or that it's situated in, we still never sort of, or we still don't primarily experience these objects as these, like, bearers of sensory qualities. We still sort of are grasping them in some kind of context, even if it's a different context, like exhibiting in an art gallery, as opposed to using the hammer to hammer in nails. So yeah, we still always have these sort of contextual grasp of objects, even when we do sort of extract them from their normal context, or the context that they're intended for.
By the way, the reference to Cezanne, Merleau-Ponty talks about this in a different text where he writes about Cezanne, but he talks about how Cezanne becomes sort of increasingly withdrawn as he gets older and moves back to, I think it's Aix-en-Provence, and how even when he's painting faces, he tries to paint them as if they were objects. And there he's making a point about Cezanne's well-being, which I actually found kind of annoying. I read it, but here I think he's saying that it's a difficult thing to do, to try to look at a face objectively and see the features that you normally gloss over when you are just recognizing it as a face, without sort of thematizing all of the various features.
Yeah, I think it's not exactly the same sort of process as observing a face, but I remember thinking a while ago about, like, how if you asked me to, like, um, draw the layout of a keyboard, for example, like where the letters are, like, I would get the WERTY, and everything else would be just the even though, of course, I'm typing, I can um, less find all the letters, obviously with typos, but where the letters are without looking at the keyboard. So in some sense, I clearly know where the letters are. But then if you ask me to, like, recall that knowledge, then yeah, I would not perform very well in that. As you can have a knowledge of someone's face in the sense that you can recognize them out of a crowd and so on, while at the same time, like, if you were asked to, like, describe the details that make up a face, or to draw, assuming you are, like, skilled at drawing to the extent that you would be able to reproduce the face. Like, if you are asked to draw the face from memory, there might not be that fiction of that person's face, even though you're really capable. So this sort of grasp of the person, the structure of the face is not necessarily sort of tied to a grasp of, like, the elements that make up the face, the shape of the mouth and the nose, and etc., and, like, the different and all that. Yeah, exactly. So, like, our capacity to, like, recognize someone's face is not sort of made up of, like, a knowledge of, like, the ratio of their nose length to their eye width and so on. Like, this sort of very precise measurement of all the features that make up that face. So yeah, it's a very different kind of grasp than, like, so yeah, when you are interested in drawing that person's face, you do have to sort of grasp the relationship between all these features in a way that, like, actually takes practice to be able to see these relationships. Like, it's hard work to sort of look at a face and focus on those features, like, what exactly do these person's eyes look like, and how can I capture that in a drawing or a painting? Um, that's not something even someone who is like maybe technically skilled at producing accurate drawings of something would potentially have a hard time like sort of focusing on the details of that eye shape and appearance and putting that onto a page. Um, yeah, it's a skill that you have to practice and acquire as opposed to something that's sort of immediately given in perception. Okay, let's go on to the next bit. So if someone can read from bottom of 167, everything which we know.
Yeah, I can read. Um, Everything which we know of infantile perception and its lacunae permits us to think that the meaning of a word is not determined in the mind of the child by the comparison of objects, which he designates in turn, but by the cross-checking of the logical context of which it is successfully a part. Of which it is successively a part. It is not because two objects resemble each other that they are designated by the same word. On the contrary, it is because they are designated by the same word, and thus participate in the same verbal and affective category, that they are perceived as similar. Thus, even when it is addressed to natural objects, nascent perception is still related to them through certain artifacts, the words, and nature is perhaps grasped initially only as that minimum of stage setting which is necessary for the performance of a human drama, a remark which is not new, if it is not taken in a strict sense. People have long spoken of infantile quote-unquote animism, but the expression seems improper to the extent that it evokes an interpretation in which the child would confer a signification on the qualitative givens which is distinct from them, would construct souls to explain things. The truth is that there are no things, only physiognomies. Just as in adults a mescaline intoxication can give animal appearances to objects and make an owl out of a clock without any hallucinatory image whatsoever. Open quotes. In nature, says Goya, there are as few colors as lines. End quotes. But even if there is no line which does not have a physiognomy for the child, still the physiognomy must be delineated in a minimum of matter. What can be the appearance of this sensible support? It is here that the notion of quote-unquote form will permit us to continue the analysis. The form is a visible or sonorous configuration, or even a configuration which is prior to the distinction of the senses, in which the sensory value of each element is determined by its function in the whole and varies with it. The thresholds of chromatic perception are different for the same spot of color, depending on whether it is perceived as quote-unquote figure or quote-unquote ground. This same notion of form will permit us to describe the mode of existence of the primitive objects of perception. They are lived as realities, we have said, rather than known as true objects. Certain states of adult consciousness permit us to comprehend this distinction. For the player in action, the football field is not an quote-unquote object. That is, the ideal term which can give rise to an indefinite multiplicity of perspectival views and remain equivalent under its apparent transformations. It is pervaded with lines of force, the quote-unquote yard lines, those which demarcate the quote-unquote penalty area, and articulated in sectors, for example the quote-unquote openings between the adversaries, which call for a certain mode of action and which initiate and guide the action as if the player were unaware of it. The field itself is not given to him, but present as the immanent term of his practical intentions. The player becomes one with it and feels the direction of the quote-unquote goal, for example, just as immediate as the vertical and horizontal planes of his own body. It would not be sufficient to say that consciousness inhabits this milieu. At this moment, consciousness is nothing other than the dialectic of milieu and action. Each maneuver undertaken by the player modifies the character of the field and establishes in it new lines of force in which the action in turn unfolds and is accomplished, again altering the phenomenal field. Do I keep reading? Maybe this last paragraph.
Yeah, I think it's a good place to stop, actually. Yeah,
Okay.
thanks. Yeah, so I think, yeah, so there's a couple of things here. So yeah, this idea that our perceptual grasp of objects as being similar or as belonging to the same category is related to the fact that we use the same word for them as opposed to the other way around. So like maybe like a sort of empiricist approach to to the use of language, for example, would say that like we see a bunch of things that are sort of similar to each other, and then we come up with some word, or we learn a word from our parents or whoever that designates the group of these objects that are similar to each other. So we call these things trees because we see that they resemble each other, or we observe certain properties that they share, or whatever. Um, but his account here is the other way around. So it's not that we first see a bunch of things, notice that they're similar to each other, and then apply a word to designate the group of things that have these similarities to each other. It's that we are sort of brought up using a certain word tree for these objects that makes us sort of become aware of what they share. And then as Gray mentioned in the chat here, so like a category like tree that we use all the time, it doesn't really have any sort of biological significance. There's no sort of class of plants that constitute trees as such that doesn't include other things that are not trees in terms of like a phylogenetic categorization of plants. So like tree, the category tree is like a kind of qualitative category that has to do with our experience, our perception of these objects as, or these organisms as being vaguely similar to each other. But that similarity is sort of, or the fact that we sort of notice this similarity comes about because we use this word tree for these different plants. And yeah, and like, so this is something that also has come up in, I don't know as much about like plant phylogenetics, but there's this whole sort of approach to phylogenetics in general called cladistics, which is meant to sort of replace these categories that we use. These categories that we use sort of from like sort of common sense or everyday life encounters with organisms, and replace them with classifications that are meant to be sort of autonomous in the sense that each category would contain a group of organisms that are a lineage that is sort of exclusive and exhaustive. So you would group all the organisms that are, each category would group a set of organisms that are all related to each other in the same way, and then would exclude any other organisms that are not related in that way. And most of the sort of categories that we're familiar with actually don't have this property. So for example, a category like reptiles doesn't group a set of organisms that are all related to each other while excluding other organisms that are not reptiles. So for example, reptiles would our sort of common sense category of reptiles would include things like lizards and turtles and alligators, but would not include birds. But there's actually no category of like, if you sort of study the branching of lineages, there's no category that actually fits those criteria. You would instead have to include, if I remember correctly, the alligators and crocodiles go together with birds, and then the turtles and lizards and snakes would be another category. So yeah, like our everyday concepts, or the concepts that we're familiar with that we've sort of inherited from our like tradition of studying organisms, don't necessarily correspond to any sort of biological classification of those organisms. And at the same time, like looking at a bird, we sort of see it as different from an alligator, and the alligator maybe looks more similar to a lizard than it does to a bird. But this is partly like the fact that this similarity is like stands out to us is in part a product of the fact that we use these categories like reptile for these organisms. And then so maybe if we like were brought up with these cladistic categories, if we had always been told that birds and alligators belong together, and then lizards and turtles belonged in a different category, maybe we would sort of see the alligator and the bird as similar to each other, and as opposed to like having the differences stand out to us. So yeah, so this is like another way that another way that our experience of objects, in this case organisms, but this applies to any type of object, our experience, our perception of these objects is not sort of a perception of the objects in terms of like their possession of or exhibition of certain sensory qualities. So yeah, we are always we're aware of particular sensory qualities of objects insofar as we sorry, our awareness of the qualities of these objects is sort of mediated by our um, categorization of those objects. So we, you know, certain features of the object seem important or stand out to us in part because we grasp that object as an example of this category of object. So yeah, that's so another sort of I guess top-down aspect of perception. And then the second bit is yeah, this example of the football player I think is an important one because when you think of, I mean, and you know, even like most of us have some experience, I guess, of like playing sports or games of some kind, but you don't have to be like a sort of elite athlete, though of course they would have a much better capacity than the rest of us. But when you're playing a sport, you don't sort of, you know, contemplate the sensory qualities exhibited by the ball and the goalposts and etc., or like measure the angle between you and the goal and so on. You just sort of respond to the layout of the opposing players and your teammates and where the ball and the goal are and so on. Um, like all of these things just sort of fit together. You just sort of see like where the gaps are in the opposing team's defensive posture, what passes you can make to your teammates, etc. You just sort of see these as like opportunities or threats to your position. Um, uh, so like the field is not sort of given to you as like a geometrical surface with like objects sort of dispersed across it, the you know corresponding to the players and the ball and so on. It's given to you as like this sort of structured um, environment where certain forms of action are possible or not possible, or uh, desirable or not desirable. So like there's a sort of dynamic nature to this field. Like you see certain regions of the field as inviting certain actions and repelling certain other actions and so on. Um, and so this is like sort of the immediate like people always talk about, you know, sort of being in the zone when you're playing a sport or when you're like really engaged in some sort of activity, where you don't even sort of think about what to do. You just respond immediately with the correct action or with an appropriate action. And this is this kind of grasp of this dynamics of a situation where like if you like elite athletes or high level athletes also, you know, study recordings of games, and they'll like sort of analyze, you know, what did I do in this situation, did I make the right decision and so on. But that's a very different experience where you can sort of stop the tape and like you know, look at where all the players are and evaluate carefully, like, you know, should I have gone left instead of right, etc. But like in the moment, you're not doing anything like that. You're not just sort of like contemplating your options and like, you know, applying a utility function to your different courses of action or whatever. You just sort of see what the right response is, and then you do that. So yeah, it's a like the internal experience of this sort of dynamical environment, or this environment that has these sort of intrinsic dynamic properties, is very different than like watching the recording of yourself afterwards and evaluating whether you made the right decision or not.
I've been reading a little bit about Merleau-Ponty's philosophy of language, and this idea that young children, even though they aren't familiar with use objects, don't see them as just like raw sense data that they then organize on the basis of sort of repeated encounter, because their experience is basically mediated by language is interesting. I know that in Phenomenology of Perception, Merleau-Ponty argues that, at least as I understand it, that language is a privileged sort of gesture, but there is this domain of experience which corresponds to what he's calling primitive consciousness or nascent consciousness here is, I think, genuinely pre-linguistic, at least in my understanding of phenomenology of perception. So the idea that infantile perception or the perception of very young children is linguistically mediated is interesting. I don't know if to reconcile it, maybe you could say that this experience of these children is pre-linguistic, in a way that has reference to linguistic experience, but is not thematically linguistic. But I thought that was worth. Also, this example of the. Oh, sorry. Go ahead if you were going to say something.
No, you go ahead.
The example of the soccer player is the exact example that Dreyfus uses in that debate on the McDowell debate, where they are arguing whether or not there is any region of conscious experience that is not conceptual. But for Dreyfus, this example of the soccer player describes an experience that is so absorbed that there can't, strictly speaking, be said to be consciousness here at all. I think that's a misreading. Like, this obviously this is a kind of absorption state if this is somebody who is familiar with playing soccer. But he says here that consciousness is nothing other than the dialectic of milieu and action, which doesn't mean that there isn't consciousness. It just means that there isn't any sort of representative thought over and above this dialectic.
Yeah, I think like we've already seen few instances of this, but I think in general, Merleau-Ponty always wants to treat this sort of pre-reflexive layer or this pre-theoretical engagement with the world as always sort of explicitatable, if that's a word. I'm not even sure if that's a word, but like we can always reflect on our pre-reflective engagement with the world, even though our grasp of objects as having these uses, our sort of grasp of a human face, for example, is not sort of reducible to this kind of reflective contemplation of the properties of this physical object. At the same time, we can reflect on our sort of perception of objects. We can sort of we can contemplate the layout of players on the field, even though it's probably not very effective as a means of playing football. This is something that we're capable of engaging in, and it's not the case that our engagement with objects in this sort of dynamic perception and responsive action is sort of obscure or like hidden and like unavailable to um, like direct examination. We can always sort of focus on something and make it the object of attention, um, even though when we do that, we're transforming what it is we're paying attention to. So there's this again this sort of dialectical relationship between the like unexamined sort of absorbed engagement with these objects as part of a practice and having a use or having a significance, and then the like contemplation of that object. These are sort of both potential ways of examining of relating to that entity, and they're not sort of each of these ways of engaging with that entity is related to the other, and they're sort of yeah, they're connected to each other in this intrinsic way.
I just want to say briefly this. I was going back through Simondon again recently to try yet again to understand the different ways in which he uses the word transduction. And looking back at individuation in light of notions of form and information at the vital and psychic levels, Simondon refers to transduction in terms of a non-dialectical but quasi-dialectical unity of integration and differentiation, which I think lines up uh, lines up, although obviously Simondon draws different conclusions from it, with this idea of a dialectic between afference and efference, or sensation and action in Merleau Ponty. And you can maybe even see transduction as something like the form of behavior or structure of behavior in this book.
Yeah, we haven't talked too much about like the relationship between this book and or between Merleau-Ponty in general and Simondon. But that was one of the reasons why I suggested it in the first place, was to because they're both like sort of engaging with a very similar intellectual context. They're both French philosophy people in the mid 20th century that are engaging with Gestalt psychology and trying to figure out what it means for like philosophical concepts like knowledge and experience and so on. But they take it in quite different. I don't really have a sort of one sentence sort of a summary of like what the difference between them consists in, but I think that's something I'd like to understand better. Like, what is it? Where do they diverge from this? Starting from this similar set of intellectual resources. What is it that makes them go in different directions later on? So yeah, I think if anyone has like insights about that or suggestions along those lines, we can discuss that as we continue reading this book.
Yeah, I was thinking about that recently too. I was kind of thinking, like, obviously very provisionally, but like this moment in the book where Merleau-Ponty, he says he's like followed Gestaltism up to a certain point, but then he departs from the physicalism because he doesn't find it convincing. Like, maybe you could see Simondon as at the same point, just proposing a different way to understand Gestaltist physicalism that makes more sense, with individuation and potential energy and the form as form rich in potentials. But yeah, it'll be interesting to keep these things in mind as we keep reading.
Yeah, I definitely think Simondon is more sympathetic to the type of physicalism that Merleau-Ponty criticizes in the Gestalt psychologist. So this idea that there would be this like isomorphism in terms of the structures of the of physical dynamics and the dynamics of perception or of mental life in general. So like the sort of stock example is the bubble taking on a spherical shape through the minimization of surface tension, and then the formation of these good forms in perception, like precisely a circle or something like that. So I think so like the sort of it wasn't really maybe that fully worked out, I think, among the Gestalt psychologists, but the sort of idea that they were gesturing towards was like, in the same way as there's this dynamical process of minimization of surface tension that brings about this regular form of a sphere in the soap bubble, there would be some sort of similar process in our nervous system that brings about our perception of good forms. So I think Simondon would see this as an oversimplification, of course, but at the same time, I think he's more sympathetic to like seeing similar kinds of principles at work in the physical level of individuation and the psychic level of individuation, and sort of seeing how these principles are exhibited in different at different levels of individuation, and then how those differences, what relevance those differences have to the working of those principles, because obviously psychic individuation is not the same thing as physical individuation, just happening in someone's mind instead. Okay, let's go on to the next bit. I can read this one. But one might be tempted to say that those characteristics pose no special problems. That perception is first a perception of human actions or use objects would be explained simply by the actual presence of people and artifacts in the child's milieu. That perception reaches objects only through words would be the effect of language as a social phenomenon. That social structures are carried over into the knowledge of nature itself by perception would be only one further argument in favor of a sociology of knowledge. Finally, that perception opens on a reality which solicits our action rather than on truth, on objects of knowledge, would result from the reverberation in consciousness of its motor accompaniment. In other words, we would have brought to light the social and physiological determinants of perception. we would have described not an original form of consciousness, but the social or kinesthetic contents which are imposed on it by the existence of the body or the integration into a society, and which would not oblige us to modify our conception of its proper structure. On the contrary, we propose to show that the descriptive dimension of nascent perception demands a reformulation of the notion of consciousness. The simple de facto presence of other human beings, of use objects, cultural objects in the entire milieu cannot explain perception as a cause explains its effect. Consciousness is not comparable to a plastic material which would receive its privileged structure from the outside by the action of a sociological or physiological causality. If these structures were not in some way prefigured in the consciousness of the child, the use object or the quote unquote other would be expressed in it only by constructions of sensation, a progressive interpretation of which would slowly disengage the human meaning. If language did not encounter some predisposition for the act of speech in the child who hears speaking, it would remain for him a sonorous phenomenon among others for a long time. It would have no power over the mosaic of sensations possessed by infantile consciousness. One could not understand how it could play the guiding role which psychologists agree in granting to it in the constitution of the perceived world. In other words, it cannot be in virtue of the fact that it exists around the child that the human world can immediately acquire a privileged importance in infantile consciousness. It is in virtue of the fact that the consciousness of the child who sees human objects used and begins to use them in his turn is capable of discovering immediately in these acts and in these objects the intention of which they are the visible testimony. To use a human object is always more or less to embrace and assume for oneself the meaning of the work which produced it. It is not a question of upholding the absurd thesis of an innateness of these fundamental structures of conduct. Aside from the fact that innatism accords poorly with the facts, the influence of the milieu in the formation of the mind is sufficiently evident. It is clear that a child who had never seen an article of clothing would not know how to act with clothing, nor would he be able to speak or to envisage other persons if he had always been absolutely alone. It bypasses the difficulty. It limits itself to putting the contents which empiricism derives from external experience, quote unquote, in consciousness, that is, in brief, to putting them in an internal experience. Rather, the child would understand the human meanings of bodies and of use objects, or the signifying value of language before any logical elaboration, that he himself would sketch the acts which give their meaning to words and gestures. It is evident that this is not a solution. We have already seen that the child understands attitudes which he has never had the occasion of assuming. Above all, it is difficult to see why these attitudes, actualized in him in the form of innate structures and presented to him in an internal view, would be more immediately understood than when they are given to him in a view from the outside. Whether the child contemplates their external and visual appearance or whether he grasps their motor actualization in his own body, the question still remains of knowing how an irreducible unity of meaning is apprehended through these materials. Beyond the artificial opposition between the innate and the acquired, therefore, it is a question of describing the emergence of an indecomposable signification in the moment of experience itself, whether it be precocious or retarded, internal or external, motor or sensory. For a child, language which is understood or simply sketched, the appearance of a face or that of a use object, must from the beginning be the sonorous, motor, or visual envelope of a significative intention coming from another. The organization and the sense of understood language can be very minimal at first. It will be the inflection of the voice, the intonation, which will be understood rather than the verbal material. But from the beginning, the sonorous phenomena, whether I speak or another speaks, will be integrated into the structure, expression expressed. The face, whether I touch my own or I see that of another, will be integrated into the structure alter ego. Right. So yeah, he's going through maybe a couple of different objections here, or like sort of alternate ways of explaining the kinds of things that he's been talking about. So one objection would be that yes, it's true that we experience human use objects and other human beings as like these sort of central elements of perception that we observe other humans in the environment and sort of ignore the background other objects and so on. But this is only because throughout our upbringing and throughout our childhood, we are constantly surrounded by human beings and by objects produced by human beings for a purpose or to fit into some sort of context of action. So we would just sort of acquire a habit of focusing on these objects just because we're familiar with them and because we encounter them all the time as children. But the response to this is that we can't just sort of this is again just sort of trying to do this like reductionist move that would say that like our grasp of language is sort of secondary to the experience of these sounds that we eventually become familiar with and pay attention to because they're encountered so often. So we would first have like an experience of certain kinds of sounds, and then because they are repeated many times, we would maybe start to think that, oh, these sounds are important, I should pay attention to them, and eventually we would sort of extract the fact that these sounds are meant to convey a meaning or are meant to express something. But this just empirically seems to be false. And like I don't know how much of this stuff was available at the time he was writing, but there's been more recent studies with human infants that show that they are sensitive to language from a very early age, and actually even like within the first couple of days after birth, they can recognize the difference between the language that their mother was speaking while they were in the womb and other languages. Like they recognize the mother's language as like, obviously they don't understand the words or whatever, but they can recognize this is the same language my mother was speaking as opposed to some other language. Um, um, but then, yeah, the other, like maybe if you sort of take this seriously, you would have some like this, the maybe the next move or the sort of obvious step to take would be that you would say that these structures of the human face or language or whatever are innate, that infants are born having these structures already sort of present in their minds in some sense. And yeah, there's like a few sort of problems with this thesis that, well, for one thing, it's not really clear what that would even mean, right? So it's obviously not the case that children, infants are born like with an explicit awareness of the rules of grammar or something, or like the dictionary definitions of the words in their parents' language. So children do have to learn the language that the people around them speak. They have to learn the syntactic structures of the language and the meanings of words and so on. So obviously there is some kind of learning, even if there is like this sort of biasing of perception towards linguistic sounds as opposed to other sounds in the environment. But then also like this idea that there would be something like in the mind before like as soon as infants are born, that it would be innate in the infants. It's not obvious, like how is it that this sort of presence of this structure in the mind actually brings about the infant's grasp of something as having that structure? Like if the so like the presence of linguistic utterances in the environment of the infant is not sufficient for the infant to grasp the structure of those utterances, because the infant doesn't actually understand the language yet. So why would the presence of those structures in the mind of the infant sort of have this immediate consequence of being graspable by the infant? So why is it that the infant can grasp the structure of these things in its own mind when it can't grasp the structure of those things when they're outside its mind? There's this sort of idea of like an immediate transparence of the mind, that like anything that is within my mind is something I can grasp immediately, but it's not really obvious that that's the case. Or, and especially if we think of like being in the mind as being sort of present in a sort of quasi space, as like having a being a real object situated somewhere, then yeah, this idea that there would be this sort of intrinsic transparence or like immediate grasp of the contents of my own mind is definitely not obvious. So even if we suppose that, even if we accept this like innatist hypothesis that there is something, some sort of structure that is present in the infant's mind when it's born, we still have to explain how that structure is sort of put to work in the infant's grasp of linguistic utterances, and so we haven't really gotten anywhere. We're still left with the task of explaining that grasp of the structure. And so maybe like another sort of variation on this idea is that like when we sort of respond, or when we perceive someone else's utterance, when someone speaks in our presence, that we sort of grasp that speaking or that utterance by like performing a sort of covert motor action or like sketching a motor action. So like our articulatory organs in our mouth and throat and so on would sort of go through these like movements that sort of mirror or like sketch out the act of articulating the words that the other person said. And this is like part of our capacity to grasp the articulation of those words. But then again, it's the same problem of like, why is it the case that this series of movements or these like beginnings of movements in my tongue and throat and so on allows me to grasp this structure of something as expressing a meaning or communicating something? Like how is it that I can sort of grasp this structure in the case of a sequence of movements or sketches of movements in my tongue and throat, whereas I can't grasp that structure just by hearing the sound that the person said. So again, it's this sort of idea that like because this sequence of movements is like inside me, that it would be sort of transparent and that I would be able to grasp its structure immediately. And that assumption doesn't seem justified. Like it still requires, like we would still need to understand how it is that that structure is grasped. And so we haven't really solved the problem. We've just sort of waved it away.
Yeah, I don't fully understand this point that he's making about I think there's some kind of a priori that he wants to allow for, and he talks about different structures, like the structure expression expressed, or the structure alter ego, which are like these capacities to grasp significance, what he calls the emergence of indecomposable signification in experience. And I think it's maybe the structures can be understood as different qualities of intentionality. And then this emergence of signification can maybe be understood in terms of like a phenomenological institution where a sense is established and then can be applied in different situations. But I think I'll go into these domains a bit more in the next few paragraphs. But it's somewhere between like Kantian a priori and pure empiricism.
Yeah, so he is going to talk about Kant in the next, I think, next paragraph or the next couple paragraphs. But yeah, so I think, so yes, there is something like an a priori here in the sense that, yeah, so this encounter with another person. So we don't have to first learn that there is such a thing as another person, or that the world exhibits entities that have this nature of being a person. This is something that we sort of already are prepared for, from birth. We're sort of, ready to see parts of the world as being persons. But at the same time, we don't have like this sort of readiness to encounter a person in the world is not sort of something that is already given to the infant. The infant doesn't have like a little face inside its brain that it like sort of pins on top of the visual perception of its mother, for example. It's something. So it's more a way of engaging with the world that is given to us, like that is already there as when we're born. So it's like a readiness to find a person in our experience, as opposed to like some sort of pre-given form of what a person would be. So it's it's this readiness to treat certain parts of our experience as having the nature of being a person or as expressing a meaning. So there's the famous problem that actually I can't remember which dialogue that's from, but yeah, this problem of like how do we I think it might be the Meno. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So how do we like look for something without already knowing what it is we're looking for? Because if we didn't know, then how would we recognize that we found it? But then if we already did know what it was, then why would we have to look for it, right? So yeah, anyway, that's sort of an aside. But so we already have like, so yeah, in the case of like the person example, so we don't have like an image of the person that we, sort of have to find something that corresponds to it. We instead are maybe sort of primed to look for persons. It might be a better way of putting it. So that like from birth, we are ready to find persons in our environment and to focus on those persons and relate to those persons. But we don't necessarily have like a sort of fixed image of what a person would be that we would have to sort of like find a counterpart to in our experience. And so I think it's an a priori in the sense of like an a priori of motivation of like direction of search or something like that, as opposed to like an a priori as something that would already be present in our minds at birth. Because this is like again just the sort of innateness hypothesis that sort of falls under the same criticisms that he had given before. And I think this is also like again we'll talk about Kant more in the next bit. Yeah, it's a good way of putting it. A disposition to find relevance in certain stimuli. Yeah. So yeah, like in the example that I mentioned earlier with the infants, that like if you just play random noises or you play the sound of someone speaking, the infants will pay more attention to the person speaking, the recording of the person speaking. Already from I think even a few hours after birth, like so long before they could have like acquired through experience the idea that linguistic sounds are important for some reason. So like this readiness to treat human speech as important and worth paying attention to and so on is already present from birth or from very soon after birth. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there's like this sort of innate structure of language that is like present in the mind of that infant. Like obviously the infant still does have to learn how to speak the language or how to understand the language. But the other point that I was going to mention is yeah. So this I think we'll talk about this more with when we get to the part about Kant. But like the distinction between like an a priori structure and something innate in the mind is not always clear. I think in Kant himself and in later writers as well that sort of build on Kant's work. Like you can get the impression I think from Kant's writing, and this may even be how he understood what he was trying to say, is that like there just is this sort of structure of space and time in our mind that is sort of present there from birth and then gets filled up with like various sensations and so on. But like yeah, it's not even really clear exactly what that would mean. Like obviously if time is like a form of our perception, then it's hard to say, like it's hard to explain what it would mean for time to be innate or like present before our birth, or like you're already using temporal concepts to describe when time sort of appears in the mind. So it's already sort of confusing at that level. But then just the sort of idea that space and time would be like sort of entities that are present in this quasi space of the mind, and then that sort of would like explain our capacity to grasp objects in space and phenomena in time and so on. This is already sort of like again sort of presupposing that like self-transparent or this like immediate grasp of what's in the mind, which is an assumption that doesn't seem to be justified. So yeah, we're still left with the problem of explaining like, okay, suppose we do have this a priori form of perception of experience that is time. How do we sort of use this form of experience in our temporal grasp of phenomena, of situating our experience in time, relating events to each other in time, etc. So that whole problem is not really like explained just by saying, oh, there's this form of experience. So yeah, like whether exactly that says about Kant's own work is not 100% clear. Whether that's sort of the picture that Kant had in mind, or whether there's something more sophisticated that we can extract from his writing, I think is maybe a question of Kant interpretation. But yeah, there's this sort of idea, or a lot of the use of Kant just sort of takes it that like this a priori form of experience that is time or space, like just saying those words sort of solves the problem, but it it doesn't really solve the problem. It just sort of puts a label on the problem and then like sweeps it into the corner. So yeah, we want to look at like the actual engagement of our how do we make use of these forms of experience or these structures that we as being temporal or spatial structures. Yeah, maybe as an aside, yeah, just this bit about the immortality of the soul in Kant is an interesting bit because in the I can't remember if it's in I think it's in the Critique of Practical Reason or possibly in the groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals. He's talking about the question of what is the relationship between character and morality. So like there's this idea, morality of course has to do with doing our duty for Kant. But then you could say like, the fact that I have a disposition or a character to do certain things that maybe are contrary to my duty, or on the other hand, maybe I do have a disposition to do things that do accord with my duty. Like this disposition is not something that I have myself chosen. I sort of find myself with a disposition to do certain things or not do certain other things. So how can I be like blamed for something that I didn't, choose? The disposition which it brings about the actions that I'm sort of blamed for. And Kant's answer is this sort of very strange account according to which we sort of choose our dispositions like prior to our birth or like outside of time in some strange way. So like, yeah, we are actually responsible for our dispositions, even though sort of empirically, of course, we don't like choose, I'm going to be like a greedy person or whatever. Yeah, this is in Kant. I think it's in the Critique of Practical Reason, but I'd have to find the passage. But yeah, so like, yeah, we don't, of course, sort of, empirically choose that I'm going to be a greedy person or a generous person or a jealous person or whatever. These are just sort of traits that we, find ourselves having. Maybe we acquire it through, our relation to other people and our experiences and the habits that we cultivate and so on. But it's not something that we like generally sort of experience ourselves as choosing. But the fact that we sort of blame people for being a greedy person or praise people for being a generous person, etc. For Kant is only explicable if we sort of acknowledge this disposition or character as being the result of a choice. So yeah, we have to sort of suppose that there is this kind of choice of character like outside of time or prior to our acquisition of that character. But then of course what's even weirder about this is that like if we don't have this disposition or we don't have any like if we don't have a character to start with, how do we actually make that choice in the first place? So what is it that makes one person choose a greedy disposition and another person choose a generous disposition? Like if there's no like disposition present that would sort of explain these choices in the first place, like the disposition is what is supposed to be explained by this choice, but then we need something like a disposition to explain why someone would choose any of these dispositions. So yeah, it's this very strange sort of moment in Kant's moral philosophy. But that's sort of an aside here. But yeah, I think this account trying to come up with an account of the a priori that would not sort of be reducible to something to either like just the brute fact that some structures are present in our mind, at birth, like I don't know, God implanted them in my soul when I was created or whatever. That would be sort of the Cartesian, I guess, account of this, or like I chose them sort of outside of time before I was born, or not. You can't even say before I was born, but like external to the temporal structure of experience, and maybe in Kant's sort of picture. So trying to come up with an account of the a priori that doesn't sort of require these seemingly dubious notions of like implanting these structures in the soul or a choice that happens outside of time or something like that.
I can read next.
Oh, okay. Here,
Oh, go ahead. Sorry, 61. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, we lost 61. Okay, I guess you want to go?
Yeah. In other words, as soon as nascent consciousness is taken as the object of analysis, one realizes that it is impossible to apply to it the celebrated distinction between a priori form and empirical content. Reduced to what is incontestable about it, the a priori is that which cannot be conceived part by part. It must be conceptualized all at once as an indecomposable essence. The a posteriori, on the contrary, designates what can be constructed vis-a-vis thought, piece by an assemblage of external parts. The essence of Kantianism is to admit only two types of experiences as possessing an a priori structure, that of a world of external objects, that of states of the inner sense, and to relate all other specifications of experience, for example, linguistic consciousness or consciousness of other persons, to the variety of a posteriori contents. Thus, a word can be only a sonorous phenomenon, a moment of external experience to which a signification, that is a concept, is secondarily adjoined and associated. Another person can consist only of the coordination of a multitude of phenomena of external experience subsumed under a concept, which is taken from the inner sense. The fact that Kant has gone beyond the empiricist notion of the association of states by discovering consciousness as the condition of this association does not change the fact that the relation of meaning to word remains a conceptualized contiguity. The act of speaking, a banal conceptual operation, accompanied by a phonation mechanism which is contingent with regard to it. Finally, it does not change the fact that another person remains a derived notion by means of which I coordinate certain aspects of external experience. But child psychology precisely proposes the enigma of a linguistic consciousness and a consciousness of others, which is almost pure, and which is prior to that of sonorous and visual phenomena, as is sufficiently showed by the magical and animistic beliefs of the child. Speech in other persons, therefore, cannot derive their meaning from a systematic interpretation of sensory phenomena and the quote-unquote multiple given. They are indecomposable structures, and in that sense are a prioris. But a double consequence with regard to the definition of consciousness follows from this. Since the distinction between sensible content and a priori structure is a secondary distinction, justified in the universe of natural objects known by adult consciousness, but impossible in infantile consciousness. And since there do exist, quote, material a prioris, unquote, concept of consciousness, which we must formulate is profoundly modified. It is no longer possible to define it as a universal function for the organization of experience, which would impose on all its objects the conditions of logical and physical existence, which are those of a universe of articulated objects, and which would owe its specifications only to the variety of its contents. There will be sectors of experience which are irreducible to each other. Should read this next paragraph, it's kind of long.
Yeah, go ahead.
At the same time that one abandons the notion of the quote-unquote multiple given as the source of all specifications, one will doubtless be obliged to abandon the notion of mental activity as the principle of all coordinations. Indeed, as soon as one refuses to separate the relation from the different concrete structures which appear in experience, it is no longer possible to found all relation on the activity of the, quote, epistemological subject, unquote. And at the same time as the perceived world is fragmented into discontinuous, quote-unquote, regions, consciousness is divided into different types of acts of consciousness. In particular, the fact that primitive perception is, as it were, haunted by human presence and lacunary for all the rest, obliges us to accept the fact that, quote-unquote, others, although they may be reached in adults through, quote-unquote, sensations or, quote-unquote, images, can also be known by means of very impoverished representational contents. Therefore, there must be several ways for consciousness to intend its object and several sorts of intentions in it. To possess and contemplate a quote-unquote representation and to coordinate a mosaic of sensations. These are special attitudes which cannot account for all the life of consciousness and which probably apply to its more primitive modes, as a translation applies to a text. Desire could be related to the object desired, will to the object willed, fear to the object feared, without this reference, even if it always includes a cognitive nucleus, being reduced to the relation of representation to represented. Acts of thought would not be alone in having a signification, of containing in them the prescience of what they are seeking. there would be a sort of blind recognition of the object desired by the desire and of the good by the will. This is the means by which a person can be quote unquote given to a child as the pull of his desires and fears, long before before the long work of interpretation which would arrive at the person as a conclusion from a universe of representations. This is also the means by which confused sensory ensembles can nevertheless be very precisely identified as the bases of certain human intentions. It may happen that in entering a room, we perceive a poorly localized disorder before discovering the reason for this impression. For example, the asymmetrical position of a picture frame. In entering an apartment, we can perceive the character of those who live there without being capable of justifying this impression or by an enumeration of remarkable details, and certainly well before having noted the color of the furniture. To actualize these justifications ahead of time in the form of, quote, latent content, unquote, or, quote, unconscious knowing, unquote, is to postulate that nothing is accessible to consciousness which is not present to it in the form of representation or content. So yeah, the structure of the argument here seems to be that something like this kind of empty universal a priori in Kantian idealism is, even though it, in some ways, he thinks it's an improvement on naive empiricism, it's really no better off than naive empiricism in explaining things like the experience of the other or the acquisition of knowledge of language, even though child psychology shows that these things are learned very quickly. Like, I think we talked about it last time, but infants recognize faces. I think it's like the first thing that an infant will respond to is a face, and especially the face of the caregiver over against other faces, which would be difficult to explain if you're seeing just in terms of association. But Kant can't really do any better than the naive empiricists on this account. So instead, Merleau-Ponty suggests that there are these domains of what he calls material a prioris, one of which would be the experience of the other, and another which would be the experience of language, although presumably there are others as well, which are kinds of intentionality and are also non-conceptual, at least not every material a priori or sector of experiences is primarily conceptual. He talks about a desire which knows the object desired and the will which knows the good without conceptual representation. He even calls it a blind recognition, which I think is a kind of reference to Kant and the famous idea that intuitions without concepts are blind. And I think he's seems to be saying here that yes, that's true, but nonetheless they're conscious and they're real domains of experience. I like this idea that when you have these sort of implicit judgments as to, for instance, the character of a person on the basis of their apartment, this can be thematized, but the thematization wasn't in the pre-thematic experience as a latent content or as an unconscious knowing. There's a kind of non-conceptual there's just a non-conceptual aspect to that kind of intentionality, which is not sort of deficiently non-conceptual and isn't perfected once it becomes conceptualized, but is somewhere between an unconscious experience and a fully conscious theoretical conceptualization.
Yeah, it's this sort of familiar rejection of the idea that we have to sort of presuppose that this sort of theoretical knowledge is the only kind of relationship to objects that we have, or is like the content is the only content that we can find in experience. So like this example of walking into an apartment and or you come home one day from work or whatever, and you step in your house or your apartment, and you just sort of realize that something is wrong. Like you can't sort of point to one specific thing and say this object is out of place, but like it doesn't look right. And then if you sort of look more carefully, then you realize maybe this something is missing, something has been moved, etc. But like you have this experience of like things not being the way they should, like first, before you find out what exactly is missing or in the wrong place. So this sort of initial grasp of something as not being organized properly, not corresponding to the intention of how you lay out your living space, for example, this grasp of like a mismatch between the way things are and the way they should be, the way they should be is prior to the grasp of the layout of the objects and the color patches and so on in the visual experience of your apartment. And not the other way around. So it's not that we first observe a bunch of objects and then compare their layout to like our mental picture of where they're supposed to be laid out, and then observe that there's like a mismatch. It's the mismatch is what's first given, and then we sort of look through or look more carefully to find where exactly that mismatch is located. And this is just sort of like a sort of a paradigm example of how our grasp of the significance in terms of like a human use or making sense of the environment is prior to the qualities of these objects as given as having sensory properties, for example, as opposed to being sort of like added on afterwards. And so like for Ponty, the Kantian approach can only sort of is sort of stuck with this like adding on afterwards process just as much as the like empiricist approach is. It's just that we have maybe more structure at the outset. We have these like spatial and temporal forms, and then we have these categories of the understanding. But then still, if we want to grasp something like a human face, it's still something that we have to sort of like intellectually put together from the manifold of sense experiences that we later come to see as being the experiences of that face. And then so for Merleau-Ponty, it's actually the other way around, that we first have the experience of the face, and then sometimes, maybe not everyone actually does this, it's something that requires effort and training. We can analyze our experience of the face into colors and shapes and so on. But that's like a sort of secondary process that doesn't have to happen, as opposed to being like the first step that leads to the experience of the face. So I think we can, let me just look ahead. Yeah, we have a few more pages. So yeah, let's stop here for today. Sorry, I'm just getting to the right page again. I think we'll stop here for today, and we can pick up from page 173 next time.